Our next speaker is Camille Wicher. Camille is Vice President of Corporate Ethics and Research Subject Protection at the Roswell Park Cancer Institute, serving as counsel for risk management and corporate compliance, leading the corporate ethics department and acting as an advisor to scientists, clinicians, and the administration regarding ethical practices and scientific integrity, within all facets of the Institute. She earned her JD in 1989 from the State University of New York at Buffalo Law School. Her former legal practice concentrated on personal injury, medical malpractice, and professional conduct matters. Camille is a member of the American Health Lawyers Association, the Erie County Bar Association, the American Society of Hospitals Risk Managers, and the New York State Commission on Quality of Care Surrogate Decision-Making Committee. She also holds a BS in nursing and an MSN in adult health and nursing from the State University of New York at Buffalo.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, everyone. Let me see if I can turn this on. Am I okay? See if we can find my PowerPoint.
There's a stop.
So I'm going to come at this from a slightly different perspective than Debbie did, although some of my slides, which I'm going to flip through quite quickly, cover some of the same material she did, and I don't want to bore you with duplicity. But part of my job at Roswell Park Cancer Institute is to try and keep all of our clinicians and scientists from committing any kind of misconduct. Not that they do it intentionally, but I think we've seen every aspect of misconduct. We've had falsification and fabrication of data that we actually worked with the Office of Research Integrity on an investigation of one of our scientists, which led to the article, which I'm going to discuss towards the end of the presentation, or for most of my presentation, which is on the cost of misconduct and what we determined that cost was to the institution and maybe to the community. We've also seen plagiarism, both on the part of our staff members who have plagiarized. In fact, we had a PhD student who was almost done with his dissertation who plagiarized most of his introduction and background, which we ultimately dismissed from the program. And also when our scientists and clinicians have had publications that have been plagiarized and what was done about that. And I think from a publisher's perspective, or someone who's involved in journal editing, that some decisions, like Debbie said, really have to be made and have to be thought about what is the process for dealing with that. Because from our perspective, we have not had very good results with publishers and editors with regard to plagiarism when we have found somebody else plagiarizing our scientists' articles. So just to start off, this is, as Debbie alluded to, a pretty, I would say, maybe not common, but oft heard about problem. There's been a lot of findings of scientific misconduct of all kinds, a lot of cases going back a long period of time, and I'm not going to go through all of these in great detail. I'm just doing this to show you what the depth of the situation was. And some of the sanctions, all the way from Eric Coleman's misconduct, relied on a federal grant and fabricated more than decades of work on obesity, menopause, and aging while at the University of Vermont. He served a prison term for a year. There have been other discoveries that might have merited Nobel Prizes that have been found to be misconduct or fabricated data. Debbie already talked about William Summerlin, and he was the one who put the black patches on the mics. Robert Slutsky was a radiologist. Of 137 publications, 77 were valid, 48 were questionable, and 12 were found to be fraudulent. This goes on and on. Darcy also. More recently, Anil Patti, he was accused of misconduct and resigned. He had 3 clinical trials that were terminated based on his research and the retraction of the key paper he authored. And these were cancer treatment trials. This was a 60 Minutes, actually, article, and he claimed to be a Rhodes Scholar and was found not to be a Rhodes Scholar. And all of his problems led to the unraveling of all of his claims about his breakthrough in cancer treatment. And this was at Duke, and this was as soon as this past February of 2012. So there's a lot of misconduct allegations out there and a lot of examples you could cite to. But why do researchers jeopardize their careers? That's always been kind of my issue, dealing with this from the institution side. Why would someone who has a prominent career do something to jeopardize their career? They fabricate data, they're shock scientists, lots of questions, what happened and when. If the allegations are true, a well-respected scientist jeopardizes their career. And there are some main motivators to commit misconduct, and Debbie alluded to some of them. There's career pressure. It's still very strongly a career-driven discipline. Scientists depend on reputation to get support and funding, and a good reputation relies on publications of high-profile scientific papers. So there's a very strong imperative in science, as in some other disciplines, to either publish or perish. And clearly this could motivate some scientists to fabricate the results, and has motivated scientists to fabricate the results. Also, knowing the right answers. Even when some scientists falsify data, they never do so with the intent to deceive or introduce false information into scientific knowledge. They do so because they believe what they are doing is true. In the case that led to the publication of the paper, which I'm going to talk about, which happened at our institution at Roswell, that was what the scientist did. She so firmly believed in what her data would show if she did the experiment that she photoshopped, she falsified and fabricated her data, and put that into a grant. Because she knew that if she got the funding for that and actually did the experiment, that's what the results would show. And she firmly believed that. And also the ability to get away with it. In most fields, science is difficult to reproduce accurately. And so that means that if the scientist does falsify some of the data, sometimes it's never found out. So self-policing is one of the things that scientists say works for them. And according to the Association of American Medical Colleges, the principal deterrent, which Debbie already alluded to fraud is the overwhelming probability that false data will be quickly detected. So does it work? Does anybody actually think this works? Anybody? Actually, it doesn't work. It doesn't work very well. Peer review is one of the self-policing aspects in which experts advise the government about what scientific work should be funded based on peer review, other articles, other scientific data. There's a referee system in which some of the scientific journals send a manuscript out for review to judge whether it merits publication. And there's what is supposed to be the gold standard of science, which is replication, in which scientists in distant labs can repeat the work to see if it stands up. So it doesn't really work. And there are numerous citations out there in the misconduct examples that show that it doesn't work. For example, in Darcy's case, the misdeeds were identified by the failure of others to confirm his work after publication. So not many of those misdeeds were able to be identified through replication. Peer review is also little or no publication. Most of Darcy's fraudulent work was published in peer-reviewed journals, some with very exacting standards. In the case of 2 papers, no suggestion of dishonesty was raised by any of the referees or editors, when in fact a glaring error in one case slipped past reviewers. Emory investigators noted that Darcy claimed to have obtained at least 12 human hearts for experimentation just hours after death. And this would not have even been humanly possible. So rather than a self-policing system, what might we do about this? There could be closer supervision and more contact among researchers to be the best way to prevent fraud and to prevent and detect fraud. Federal investigators who lacked supervision at Harvard contributed to the ease in which Darcy faked his scientific output over 2 years. And again, if you are the principal investigator or the chair of the department, do you really go through detail in all of the publications and all of the experiments that are brought forward or discussed at lab meetings on a weekly basis? You generally tend to believe what your scientists, what your staff are telling you and what the results are. There's also the claim that co-authors should know each other's work inside and out, and that doesn't seem to work too well either. A lot of co-authors will claim they had no responsibility at all for what happened simply because they're honest and had no hand in manipulation of the data. And we see this in publications. Although every author on the publication is supposed to sign off, in fact, a lot of them don't actually sign off until the paper is published or the paper has been submitted for publication. They don't read through the article that has been submitted to be published. And we've had that issue at our institution as well, and I think it's a pretty common problem. In fact, the American Physical Society changed its professional guidelines in response to the Belshon case. So now they include that while not all co-authors may be familiar with all aspects of the research presented in the paper, all collaborators, so all co-authors should have in place an appropriate process for reviewing and ensuring the accuracy and validity of the reported results. And co-authors should be aware of that process. They should at least know what experiments and measurements were carried out and why. So they ought to understand what's been done and be able to justify that. Debbie talked about the ORI, and their stand, I think, is the shared responsibility of institutions, funding agencies, journal editors, and principal investigators to help keep colleagues from committing fraud. And I think the institution, the place where the scientists are practicing, is the bottom line to try to police that and make sure that that doesn't happen. Education is key, and there has to be training, and we do some training. We warn, obviously, against doing any kind of falsification and fabrication intentionally. Training is mandatory for any student working on research grants at the NIH, but you have to question whether that goes far enough, whether there is enough mentoring, whether there is enough policing. Conducting audits, I've always struggled with how to do that. How can I, as an attorney and a nurse, go into somebody else's lab and audit the data? We've had instances where we're pushing some development out to be commercialized, and the data for the test that's trying to be commercialized can't be reproduced. And somebody will always say to me, well, did you check the data? Did you make sure the data wasn't falsified or fabricated? I'm not sure that I could do that, and even putting together a panel of scientists that don't really have expertise in that area, how would we be able to tell that? And tell that in a timely manner so we could still take that science and push it out to commercialization. And then investigating fraud. Once somebody makes an allegation, then you can investigate it and try to the best of your ability to prove whether or not fraud's been committed. There is, of course, individual responsibility. We set clear rules for data collection and analysis. We review data when we can. We try to check raw data, and we try to have our co-authors and co-investigators on any type of publication check that, but often there isn't time to do that, and it's not done. So, like I said, the Institute bears responsibility for the inquiry, investigation, and adjudication of research misconduct, and because we receive public funds, we do have a misconduct policy at our institution. And these are some of the things that we have done and that we did in the case that I'm going to discuss shortly. And that is, regardless of what the Office of Research Integrity does, because in our particular case, it took the Office of Research Integrity 5 years to complete their investigation. We didn't want to wait that long. We had a scientist who had basically admitted that she committed fraud. So we closed her lab. And that is something that we took into consideration when we were doing the cost analysis to what this might cost the Institute. We disciplined the scientist in terms of terminating her employment with us. And you can do any number, obviously, of a range of sanctions and disciplinary matters when you're at an institution. And these are some of the administrative actions that can be taken by the ORI, and Debbie might have alluded to some of them. It goes all the way from correction or retraction of a research record or publication to suspension or debarment from receiving any kind of public health system funds. What is it? Debbie already said this as well. It's defined as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism, practices we have in our policy that seriously deviate from those that are commonly accepted within the research community for proposing, conducting, or reporting research. And we struggle with what that means as well as the institution, at the institution, because what is a serious deviation to one scientist may not be a serious deviation to another scientist. How common is it? Debbie talked about this as well. Data on misconduct really wasn't collected until probably the early 1990s. And the estimated overall research misconduct in the United States has been estimated to be 1 case per 100,000 researchers, given that there are 2 million active investigators in the United States. And this is just some data that I collected, and I got it from Columbia. Their website, between 1990 and 2002, the Office of Inspector General at NSF investigated 800 allegations of misconduct in 600 cases. They resulted in 60 or 10% of them being deemed misconduct, and actions range from debarment to reprimand with the recovery of fines. In 2002, the ORI reported that 99 institutions had 83 cases of misconduct, with 71 institutions reporting a new allegation. So you can see some of the data there. We report every year to the ORI, as almost every other institution does that receives public health service funds, how many cases of misconduct we've investigated, how many allegations were made, and how many inquiries we conducted. And in 2010, there were 155 allegations, 28 new cases. It's been a 15% decrease since 2009. But you have to wonder if there's really been a decrease in misconduct or a decrease in the reporting of misconduct. And I found this fascinating. 2% of scientists interviewed by Finelli admitted to committing scientific misconduct, and 14% knew of colleagues that did, and did nothing about it. So these are the costs that we've investigated. Investigative costs, remediation costs, human costs. We published this article, which you can read. There's a citation if anybody's interested. We tried to see what we could measure directly with real dollars. The single investigation that we conducted from the scientists I alluded to cost us approximately $525,000. Now, the big cost was the salaries for witnesses and investigators. And like Debbie said, we don't do many of these. So it's not like we've got the system down pat. If we get an allegation of misconduct, we're on the road, we can go, it doesn't cost us too much to do it. We had to put together a panel that had expertise and a panel that could be unbiased. And we had to use scientists, we used physicians, we used some of our general counsel, we had somebody from the outside come in and look at it. It took hours. It took hours to interview witnesses. It took hours to pour over lab notebooks. It took hours to do the things associated with the investigation. We figured clerical support cost us about $2,500 and another $10,000 to pay for other support staff, security, information technology staff, and forensic computer experts. Because what we did was we went in and confiscated all of the lab notebooks. We closed down the lab, actually. And so we had to have security come and escort the scientist from the institution. We had to have all the computers taken and given to a forensic computer expert so that they could download and back up the data so that we could preserve it in a forensic manner and a chain of evidence leak in case it ever came to a trial. And out of the 217 cases reported to the ORI last year, it cost institutions, we figured, more than $110 million in total to investigate scientific misconduct. That is a huge amount of funds, not to mention the human cost to this as well. We put together an algorithm. There really isn't much research out there about what it costs to conduct misconduct trials, and so we tried to develop an algorithm to identify the most significant factors associated with the cost of the average misconduct case, especially in terms of proportional variation explained, and also prediction of the aggregate cost of misconduct case conditional on measurable factors. And we had a statistician help us with that. So we came up with one model. It was a semi-additive model of aggregate cost, where you could use G and H representing known functional forms, for example, in a linear model, and MC were measurable costs, IC were intangible costs, and the little e was stochastic error. So examples of some intangible costs when you're looking at this is future earnings related to that line of research. This was a very productive scientist. She had a lot of funding, millions of dollars of funding. She was a rising star in our cadre of scientists. There was reputational damage to the institution because now we had to go back and look at, and you would question, as anybody would, everything that the scientist ever did. It affected competitiveness for future grants and contracts, because how would now the granting agencies look at us if we had this going on under our noses and didn't know about it for so many years? Negative effects on fundraising. We used to fundraise. We're a cancer institute. We fundraise, and we used to use our scientists and our rising star scientists as an attraction to try and fundraise. And for those involved in patient care, loss of patient revenue. Everything that we do at Roswell in the scientific arena, we hope to put to the bedside and try and use for cancer care and treatment, so that is also an intangible cost that we might want to look at. I think we put together this other working model, which might be a little bit easier to use. At least it would be easier for me to use, not as a statistician, where you would look at X1, X2, all the way up to X whatever as representing the factors which a given institution or institutions have the ability to measure and collect in an administrative database. And again, you get stochastic error when you want to look at that. And these are some of the factors that we would consider for inclusion, and I've already mentioned some of them already. Grant, direct, and indirect dollars returned to the funding agency. We went through every one of the scientists' grants to see whether or not we would have to return the money to the granting agency. That was a huge cost. Some of the money which was already spent on the science, and some of the science that we could show was not tainted in any way by the scientists performing the work on it, the granting agencies and funding agencies let us keep that money and continue the research. But we had to do some explaining, and we had to do some documentation of that. There were institutional legal costs. And their legal costs not only involved with conducting the investigation or looking at the data and looking and trying to make a legal decision on whether or not this met the definition of misconduct, there's also the cost where we had to reserve funds in case the scientist sued us. What if we were wrong? We terminated her. She had admitted that she did the fraud, so we were a little bit protected about that. But what if this was a scientist we dismissed without an admission? And what would we have to reserve in case there was litigation against the institution for falsely terminating her or ruining her reputation? There's the hourly cost of faculty time committed to an investigative panel. It's not just sitting at the meeting, it's going over the data. We had to take scientists away from their work and look at all of the scientists' lab notebooks. We had to look at all of her images to see which ones were photoshopped. There's the cost of sequestration of evidentiary materials. We had to keep this information sequestered and protected in a chain of custody, chain of evidence nature from the time the allegation was made up and through and post after the time the ORI got done with their investigation. The human resource related costs. We had many people working in that lab. One of the lab people had actually been the whistleblower who had brought the allegation to my attention and said there's something wrong here. This scientist is making her staff insert into grants images that no one's actually worked on. So they were fabricated experiments, how she thought the data was supposed to look to be put into the publication. And so one of the staff working in the lab came forward and said, this is not right. We need this to be looked at, and we did. All of the staff in the lab then, what do we do with those people? There were postdocs, there were graduate students who were working on projects who this person's misconduct affected. We had to find new places for those students in other labs, sometimes in labs where the lab was not doing the research that the student was involved in. So some of those students had to start all over again. There were staff members, there were research assistants, all had to be reassigned. We reassigned everybody. In Washington, when this type of situation occurred, and it was also a publicized misconduct article, the staff in that particular lab were ostracized. The outcome for them didn't turn out as well. So there's a human cost to all of this as well that can't be put into any type of a model. Institutional startup costs, we gave this scientist money to support her research. So unknowing that this would be the outcome, we lost that funding that we could have given to another scientist. Institutional Review Board, or the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, related costs for suspending and closing any type of trial. She had a lot of animal trials. She didn't have any human trials being conducted at the time. Payment of penalties related to tainted research, hourly costs associated with retracting published research. We had to go through all her journal articles, look at all the images, try to ascertain whether any of that data was fraudulent, falsified, and notify journal editors and journals if there was. And there's the hourly cost of specialized consultants needing for advisement to the investigation panel that it's needed. So I already started talking about the case. This is what we've done. There was an allegation. There was deliberation. We determined there was sufficient credible evidence to go forward with an investigation. We put together an inquiry panel, which is one of the steps that the ORI advises to see whether or not there is enough evidence to proceed to an investigation. And I already mentioned some of this. We sequestered everything. We put in place safeguards so that laboratory personnel could continue to work on research that wasn't tainted or wasn't related to this fraudulent and fabricated data. We conducted the investigation, and you can see here the numbers and how we got our numbers to show that there was $525,000 expended on this investigation. So this was the total costs. Faculty and witness salaries was the main cost. We had to interview everybody. This scientist collaborated on other grants with other scientists. Those labs had to be notified. She was collaborating with scientists at other institutions. Those institutions had to be notified. So there are other costs. Not only ours was not an investigation related to a clinical study that affected patient care at this point, and I think Debbie already alluded to this. This was what is the impact on public policy and also on medicine? What's the cost of misprescribing for years? Plagiarism, it was not involved in this particular case, but again, I think that might be an issue for the people in the audience. And I think the issue, which is not related to our investigation, but which I wanted to bring forward, is what stand should a journal really take? If someone plagiarizes from an original source, it can become an original work. The plagiarized article can become the original work in people's minds. So even if the plagiarism is discovered down the line and the perpetrator is discovered, when readers try to remember who wrote the original, they can easily confuse the two, especially if they don't go back and find a retraction when they're looking at this article. Professor Edward Wegman, 2006, paper was later retracted because parts of it were found to be plagiarized. The peer review process was also called into question. And some of the issues with regard to that. And there are other issues as well. Mariah Zilberg was a research physician. Her work was plagiarized almost verbatim without citation. This actually happened to some of the researchers in our facility. And this was the exact same thing that happened to our researchers. We sent a letter to the editor of the journal. The editor-in-chief responded that the investigator or the person who was plagiarized should contact the person who did the plagiarizing to pass on the concern. So the person who plagiarized basically apologized to the person who was plagiarized, and in our case, that was it. The editor refused to do anything about the plagiarized article that was published. So plagiarism can happen to anybody, and I think the question is, do journals really do due diligence in these circumstances in accepting the papers? And I think it's something to think about. How many people would read an erratum if it was published and to become aware of an author's misconduct? Are there any implications for other work or prior work? Now, there are a lot of plagiarism checks, and I've listed some of them here, and Debbie alluded to some of them as well, and the ORI uses them as well. And so what is the role of the journal? And I think that's what I want to leave everybody with, maybe for more discussion. Do they do nothing? Do they actually have to report it or investigate it themselves? Do they get the Office of Research Integrity involved? We called the Office of Research Integrity when our scientist was plagiarized. They were plagiarized by a scientist in Italy. And the scientist basically just lifted the article from the journal and put his name on it and republished it. So we called the Office of Research Integrity, and they asked us to just follow up on our own and try to do something working with the institution where the plagiarizer was employed and also with the editor of the journal, to report the accusation to the alleged plagiarizer. And so I just want to leave you with the thought of what do you think the role of the journal should be and what should journals do? And should there be a consistent policy? Because not every journal handles it in the same way. We've come across some very good editors, some very good journals who have taken appropriate steps and appropriate actions. So I don't want to leave anybody with the thought that journals don't do anything about it. I think that often they do, but it doesn't seem to be consistent. So in summary, misconduct is expensive in multiple ways and sometimes in unanticipated ways. If there were 28 cases, even at half of what it costs us to investigate, the cost would still be $7,350,000 in our estimation. We don't know the total cost, and more research is needed. And there have been people who have come forward and said, we estimated our cost estimates too high. We don't think we did, but it's all subject to debate. So this is just the limit of who misconduct hurt. Kind of a nice visual that I'll leave everybody with. And those are my references. So thank you. We'll take questions later.